Hello, everybody. Although usually in Belgium and the Netherlands this is time for lunch, we are here for one more panel. Thank you for being here. This is the panel that is organized by a European project, the Virtue Project, Values and Ethics in Innovation for Responsible Technology in Europe. I am very happy to chair this panel, although I'm not involved in the project, so I'm also very interested in hearing what our colleagues have to say. This panel aims at going beyond data protection, something that we hear a lot during this conference, and will focus on embedding ethical considerations that actually cultivate moral values and capabilities in practice. So we are going to discuss today the role of the GDPR in this context and engage with questions revolving around the translation of ethics considerations to practical policy and design recommendations. Without further delay, I would like to present you our panelists. Alison Parker is Assistant Professor and Program Director of the Master Program in Media and Communication, Data and Society, and she researches how people's values influence the way technology is built and how technological systems in turn change the way we work and live together. Irina Shklovski is an Associate Professor in the Technologies in Practice and Interaction Design Research Group at the IT University of Copenhagen. She is the coordinator of the Virtue Project. Next speaker will be Christian de Cunha, who is the head of private office of the European Data Protection Supervisor. He advises the EDPS and the assistant EDPS on legal and policy developments in the EU and provides support on strategic planning and communications, and he is heavily involved in the initiatives of the EDPS on ethics and digital ethics. Next speaker is Javier Ruiz, who is Policy Director at Open Rights Group. Since joining ORG, Javier has worked on open data, including being part of an advisory group to Ministry of Justice on transportation of EU Public Sector Information Directive, and he engaged in the UK data sharing open policy project at the UK Cabinet Office. Our last speaker is Annelie Berner, who is a designer and researcher at the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design. She is interested in how to understand, think about, and interact with our digital worlds, and especially how we can make data experiences that are aesthetic, tangible, and consider all of our senses from sight to taste. Last but definitely not least, I would like to introduce you our moderator, Alessandro Mantelero, who is Associate Professor of Private Law at the Politecnico University of Turin. He is Council of Europe Rapporteur on Artificial Intelligence and Data Protection and has served as an expert on data regulation for several national and international organizations. And I give him the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for us to be here, and thank you to Eleni to chair our panel. And the panel is focused on ethics. There is a lot of debate since this morning in the panel about ethics and law. Many panels, in my perception, talk about ethics but usually refer to law. So there is an overlapping between ethics and law, and what is law becomes ethics. Here in the panel we have adopted the opposite perspective. We are more focused on ethics. We try to focus what is ethics in the context of IoT and more in general data-intensive solution. So I think this panel can provide a different and complementary viewpoint to the rest of the discussion that are more related to the legal issues. So I want to start this panel with a joint presentation between Alison and Irina, and this is a typical topic related to ethics and how ethics is understood and operationalized by the developers, and is part of our project. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm here to present our project. I'm really happy to have everybody present. The Virtue Project, Values and Ethics in Innovation for Responsible Technology in Europe, the idea that we brought together with a lot of amazing partners is that there's a lot of conversation about ethics, but how are ethics enacted when technologies are developed is not something that's been considered. really, we were interested in who is responsible for ensuring that connected devices we allow into our lives behave ethically. Is it regulation? Certain regulation has something to do with it. Is it law? Is it the consumers? Certainly, the consumers may need to think about it. But fundamentally, the people that develop technologies have some idea of what is ethical and what is right. And these ideas and these values are embedded and enacted as these technologies are developed. So understanding how that is done and perhaps intervening was the goal of the project. Our goals then were to understand how ethics are enacted, to generate a new framework for thinking about impact assessment, not just looking at privacy, but also the ethical and social impact assessment. And finally, we want to develop tools that help developers think about ethics and self-assessment as part of the design and development. Not as something that gets embedded or that gets imposed, but something that is embedded from within and used in the process of development. Part of the reason for that is because we think that development in and of itself is an ethical act. And as an ethical act, it needs to be thought of and supported in the reflection that needs to happen. Because technologies are not developed in a vacuum. They're part of and embedded in the social context of developers that make them. And they're shaped by the constraints and power relationships that look at how, that manage how technologies are developed. So in order to do this, we focused on small-scale developers and startups as spaces where we can intervene and potentially make a difference. The talks that you'll hear today come from different backgrounds and different views on the same subject. We've been working on this for 2 years, and we're getting ready to develop and release our tools. So that's where we are now. But I'll give the word to Alison to talk about what we've learned by working with developers.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather today, so bear with me if I sound a bit like a frog who's arrived in a snowy Brussels from the bottom of a pond. I have been working on the one of the empirical portions of this work, which has been focused on identifying how people within startups and small organizations conceive of the Internet of Things, how they do their work as they are designing the Internet of Things, how ideas about ethics, values, regulation, and compliance are discussed across these developer communities. And all of this empirical work feeds into both a policy analysis that Javier is going to talk about and some policy responses, and also to the development of the PESIA framework, which Alessandro is working on from Politecnico de Torino. I want to start by saying that one of the main things that we've identified thus far in the project is that there is a very, we are in a moment of a kind of like ethical excitement. Ethics is a very hot topic. You have all sat in rooms like I have where people are talking about ethics of AI, ethics in connected systems, the right way to pursue an ethical approach to technology design. And as a philosopher of technology, this makes me both delighted and very dismayed. It makes me delighted because finally people are talking about the things that I have been working on for years, but also dismayed because I am starting to see that there is a push towards ethics as a kind of voluntary set of behaviors that a company might pursue, which is perhaps allows them not to be held to strong regulatory standards. So I want to be very clear about the approach that I take in my work as part of this project, which is I think of ethics as building upon the principles of regulation. Ethics is something that we should be concerned about in addition to compliance with regulation, because of course ethical principles are already codified in the regulations, which hold people to account inside technology development and outside as well. So I want to be clear that we are pushing back on ethics washing. We've had a long-term joke between myself and Javier that some of these ethical frameworks sometimes appear to be a little bit like indulgences printed by the medieval Catholic Church. You go as a company to an ethics board, you get a certificate that says that you are good. This is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the real moral struggles that people engage in during their work and in their lives, and how to allow people the space and time to have those deep and difficult conversations in the context of building small businesses. So, how can we find ways and means to orient startups and small companies towards the regulatory frames and compliance frameworks that would help them to make their businesses ethical? This is now our project. We understand that people have their own sense of what is good. We've also identified that a lot of companies, small companies included, have values and principles that they are acting in, they are attempting to fulfill through the production of their products. So, what we have been thinking about is how to encourage and facilitate a pivot towards ethical practices within small companies by creating a set of tools and frameworks that identify which regulations and standards might be appropriate for these companies to actually strive to reach or to comply with or to exceed compliance with in order to build the kind of businesses that they want to build. In the meantime, we have interviewed hundreds of people and spent hundreds of hours in places like IoT meetups. I have a small team of researchers who has been helping to undertake this work, and today I'm going to talk about some of the research that Funda Ustiksbilda has produced in her work interviewing IoT developers. And she identifies there are two groups of people who are working in small companies. There are doers who are trying to align their goals with the goals of their company. These are people who perhaps refuse major investments because the origins of the funds don't fit with their personal values, or developers who split from their co-funders because they don't agree on how to continue an ethical direction in their company. So these are people who are trying to do ethics. So we would like to provide some ways for these people to better align their doing with the regulatory frames that would help them to do that. However, we've also found quite a lot of postponers, and I will read you an excerpt from an interview that Funda completed. She was speaking to a woman who said that she and told her she was researching ethics, and the woman said, "Ethics?" As if she did not hear. Funda nodded and said, "Yes, ethics." And the woman looked at her kind of puzzled and confused, as if ethics were the keys she'd recently misplaced. And she responded, "Oh, that. Ethics never makes it into my to-do list. Maybe one day I'll have time for it, but not at the moment, not when I'm just starting my company." So this is just one example of this idea that ethics is important, but it's something we should postpone. The consequence of this is that many small companies are leaving ethical decisions to large companies. They are hiring Google to do their back end because they say, well, Google's done all of the due diligence and they're a big company and they have the money and I just don't, so I'll just, buy in this service and maybe it's not ethical, but that's not my problem. So I think what we are trying to do in the next phase of our project is to identify that ethical design should come as a shared responsibility. It is sometimes part of a business model, but it is not only the responsibility of big tech. We also need to equip people at all levels and in all kinds of businesses with the tools to actually act on the things that they care about. So thank you.
And thank you, Alison. And sorry for this time constraint, but we have very, very intensive panel. And our speaker now is Christian D'Acunha, and I want to point out the very important role that EDPS has played in the field of ethics. It was an important initiative of EDPS focusing on ethics. They create a group of experts on ethics, but I think that the most important result, from my perspective, was the last conference in Brussels that was focused on ethics, and this gave the chance to induce many people to reflect on the ethical dimension of the use of data. So I think that this initiative from the EDPS are very important to stimulate the debate and to extend to have a broader approach in data use. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Alessandro. We've been doing, as you say, quite a bit of work on this in the last few years, particularly with Barbara, who's in the audience here. And a lot of the debate that we had in October revolved around the relationship between ethics, the law, and technology. So I wanted to just offer, just sandbox some ideas. They're not official EDS positions necessarily, but we're having an internal debate about this and talking to lots of you. So I'll just throw a few ideas out there. I'm going to talk about three things. The first is how we understand the relationship between ethics, the technology, and law. Secondly, why we think this is such a difficult issue, and why Alessandro's team and their project is a very important contribution. And then make some suggestions, some practical suggestions about the way that we can go forward. Okay, so in terms of the basics. Data protection is something which emerged in order to address power imbalances between those with the means to profit from personal data, from using personal data, and those who are concerned by the data themselves. The right to data protection is a fundamental individual right. That's a strength, but it's also a limitation. It can't address directly or comprehensively the wider impact of data practices on groups and on society, and that's why Giovanni Buttarelli, in his speech to the conference in October, was calling for, in terms of talking about respect for privacy, the need for an ethical turn. And what he was trying to say was that the way that we conceive of people's need for intimate space, whether it's individually or in their families or as a group, and respect for their freedom, that needs to be considered through an ethical lens, given the rapid spread of digital technology. There is even an argument which I've read that the focusing on the individual rather than in the collective was a post-war ploy to try to prevent the middle classes from embracing communism. I'm not sure everyone would share that view, but there is clearly a desire now, with the scandal of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook last year, to look at how data is being used, not necessarily to have an impact on individuals with their own data, but affecting society more generally and values like democracy. So by ethics, what we mean is the concept of what is right and what is wrong, and that's the concept. Those are concepts which underpin particular behaviour, and that includes the development and deployment of digital technology. So we need to interrogate ethics and expose ethics, because even when someone is behaving quote unquote unethical, we need to try to understand what's driving that behaviour. Also, very importantly, ethics does not replace the law. It should supplement the law. It's conceivable that a law is unethical or harmful, but if in a democratic environment, you should be using sustainable ethics in order to interpret the law, to fill the gaps, to consider from an ethical point of view whether laws are insufficient and they need to be developed. An ethicist at our conference said that the law floats on a sea of ethics. So ethics means looking beyond the impact of data. Ethics requires that we look beyond the impact on the individual of certain behaviour. To give you a couple of examples, there are social and environmental costs to massive processing of personal data. these devices which are sucking up data and which are then stored in servers, those are having an impact on the environment. They're even having a social impact when you consider the amount of batteries which require cobalt to be mined, and in some cases reportedly by child labour in Africa. Why is it such a difficult question to approach? It's because when we talk about technology, which we generally think is a good thing, it's difficult to separate that technology from the decisions that are being made by businesses and governments when they're applying the technology. It's said that in the West we've lost our optimism about technology. While we're thinking about Blade Runner and Black Mirror as metaphors for what's going to happen in technology, China is still thinking about Star Trek and Buck Rogers. So there is a general sense that things are not going in the right direction. It's not just looking at dystopian futures, however. There are algorithms are already the boss in many real everyday scenarios. For example, Uber drivers are basically working for an algorithm. It's designed to maximize value for the intermediary. They took a PR hit a couple of years ago when it was found that they were profiteering with their surge pricing from the New York bombings in 2016. They agreed to cap them during emergencies, but there are lower profile, bigger impacts, which again goes to ethics. Surge pricing occurs during school runs when both riders and drivers with children, it's not convenient for them to use Uber. Furthermore, the ad tech industry is based on trying to collect data by whatever means possible. Location, habits, desires, relationships, social status, jobs. Every day there's a story about the lengths to which companies will go if they're in this industry in order to collect data. And yesterday it was reported that Facebook had paid teenagers, for example, to install a VPN which secretly gathered data on them. Children are particularly susceptible here because of their long-term value to companies. So what do we do about it? My last point. First of all, I think that the current focus on bias in algorithms is a distraction, an Aunt Sally, an easy target to avoid the bigger issue of imbalances within the digital ecosystem. Even worse, from a data protection perspective, it sometimes smells like a pretext to justify collecting data, more and more data, on the grounds that it's needed in order to eliminate every trace of bias, which of course will never happen. You can never eliminate bias, and it can have the paradoxical consequence of entrenching existing exclusions. Second thing is that there needs to be a democratic discussion about public interest and social good. In the previous panel on smart cities, that's what a lot of the panelists were saying. There needs to be a framework within which you can decide whether data processing is for the common good, and as opposed to just being disproportionately allocated in terms of value to already powerful intermediaries. Thirdly, where there isn't that sort of democratic framework, there needs to be genuine accountability when something goes wrong with the technology. So, for example, a requirement to surrender the profit which has been made from practices which have caused harm, which have turned out to be harmful. It reminds me of last week in Davos, there's a video of a historian which has gone viral, where he basically says to the rich people in the audience, stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about how to combat tax evasion. Lastly, there are some technologies. I'll take a punt on this one, but I think there are some technologies like implanting bodily implants with connected things, facial recognition, drones that kill, which seem so dangerous that you should probably need a basic prohibition, except where there are licenses or international agreements, like the ability, like already applies to rules for testing and marketing drugs carrying guns in public and developing nuclear weapons. And just one very final point in terms of what a practical thing that the that companies can do at the design stage, and it goes a little bit to what Alison was talking about, that there needs to be more diversity within the lab. So there needs to be not just engineers and then engineers who then check the compliance with lawyers. It needs to be people who have experience of the humanities who can actually challenge whether or not something is going to have consequences which may not have been anticipated. So those are some ideas.
Thank you, Christian. And I really appreciate the approach of your approach, and more in general the approach of EDPS, to try to put together the natural EDPS that is a basic data protection authorities, and so it's focused on a very pragmatic approach and the ethical issues, and it's more or less what we're trying to do in this project. So focus on ethics and try to operationalize this kind of issues through a specific tool that is the privacy impact assessment, reshaped from a different perspective, in a sense of privacy, ethical, and social impact assessment. The privacy, ethical, and social impact assessment is part of our project and is based on 3 pillars: privacy, ethics, and social impact. In this sense, Javier carried out extensive investigation about the different tools that already exist that are available on ethics assessment, and so I give the floor to him to give us the result of this first analysis. Thank you, Javier.
I'm going to speak from here rather than from behind.
Raise the mic.
Yeah.
Because what places?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I'm Javier from the Open Rights Group, and so just get the right slide here. Yeah. So our contribution to the project has been actually bridging some of the gaps between the policy and the design and the applicability. So we already did some work on the regulatory aspects of IoT that were not directly related to ethics, to privacy, because as we mentioned before, there are things around environmental sustainability and compliance with lots of other things, and ethical discussions that you may not imagine, like for example, do you want to use a chip that relies on a telecom company or an open protocol? And we do have a report that if you are interested in IoT regulation, would be quite useful on the website project. But the other bit of work that we've done is trying to look at what is out there in terms of ethical tools, because one of the outputs of our project that Annelie is going to talk about afterwards is actually practical tools to support the decision. I mean, on the one hand, we are working, as we say, on the PESIA model, which is a privacy impact assessment on steroids with other dimensions for social and ethics. I mean, just to give you an idea, like for example, we will have questions around whether you have adopted specific measures to assess and mitigate other issues that are not related to privacy. But in terms of tools, what we are, the question is, why use tools? So when it comes to ethics, it's quite easy to get stuck and bogged down, and people really struggle to make decisions or to even think about it, in a structured way. So what we find is that there are tools that can help you visualize priorities, visualize positions, visualize stakeholders. Particularly, and also structure that deliberation. So you have a process, rather than having everyone, throwing ideas. What we are finding is that lots of people want to have a process where you can actually make a decision at the end, rather than get bogged down in this kind of, everything is potentially wrong. What do we do? So that's quite an important aspect. And then also the accountability, which is something that we see. It's very connected with GDPR and data protection. But again, if you want to go. The principle applies, I think, more broadly, and then of course, the implement practically, your decision. So, the kind of tools that we looked at, they vary quite a lot. So, toolkits, principles and guidelines, frameworks, scenarios. There are lots of interesting videos you can download. People make like fictional case studies, of like companies and products, and they throw like discussions around them. They're quite useful. There are even computer tools to make decisions. So we look at something like 50 of these tools, and we have an open library where we keep adding. So if you want to go to our project site, you can have a look. And I'm just going to explain, I can show you a couple of things just so you get an idea of what we're looking at. So in terms of principles, I think something that probably quite a few of you are familiar with would be, for example, the IEEE series of standards. Unfortunately, this project is actually kind of closed. You have to pay to be part of the standard development quite a lot, actually. Even for an NGO, it's like thousands, so which is a bit problematic. So I think that there are questions as to how useful or for small startups or for independent developers this kind of project can be. In such a whether you need something more open. And also, I think that the standard has got like a main framework, like it's the model process, and then people start you can get quite specialized, as you can see, like the standard for ethically driven nudging for robotic, intelligent, and autonomous system, and there are more of those. But in general, there are lots and lots of principles, guidelines, and codes. There are some codes that come from the bottom up, so lots of developers, they are now building up deontological codes, codes for developers on what to do and what not to do. There are codes, obviously, from every single association of technology engineers. They have their own code. And in general, what you find is that on paper they look good, but it's a bit debatable to what point they're actually applied. Then you have frameworks, and this is the data ethics decision aid from the people at Utrecht. They mainly use it for decisions with local authorities, and it's a whole framework where you get a group of people. It's very structured, and this is like you need people, you need commitment, you need a process, you need rooms, you need PowerPoints, like the projectors, So it's very useful, and valuable, but it's again, it's a totally different type of process, and in some contexts this can be quite useful. And there are quite a few of these as well, not just for privacy, but also for quite a few things. So here, I don't know if you can read, but you start from what algorithms, the source of your data, are you anonymizing data? There is a whole, spiral, and normally these things what you iterate, and you go once again and again, So there are, again, they can be quite useful. They are also quite involved, to follow one of these toolkits. Then you have lots of visual aids. There is a whole world out there, like lots of designers, and I think they like visual thinking, So this is the Open Data Institute Data Ethics Canvas, which is based on other canvases that are out there. And normally these things, what you theoretically should do is you put this on a wall, print out a massive copy, and then start putting like post-it notes. There's like the proliferation of post-it notes in the world. Someone will have to answer for that. At 3M. But yeah, again, useful. There are many variations. It's a lot more lightweight than following like a process like the one before, where you have consultants coming in. And so this is something that actually can be quite useful for small organizations because it's relatively easy to use, and there is added guidance. When you go to the website, and all these websites, you can get booklets and things. So quite useful. Possible issues: how can you check whether it's implemented, in practice, and the impact, So it's, but again, it is fairly useful. Then there are some. This is a game called Moral Agent, developed by some academics in the Netherlands, and there are quite a few of these things. I mean, there are card games that you can use where you can get lots of IoT components and start playing like little games. There are things like this game, which is about discovering and uncovering values and seeing how you're, whether what you think matches the reality of your product. And I think Annelie will be talking about that. And there again, these are potentially, again, for designers, something that can be very, very useful. And then we have computer and more. This is the MIT Moral Machine. I don't know if you heard about it. It's quite, slightly controversial, taking a very, very crude approach to ethics, which is basically the trolley problem. Your choice is: do you want to run over 5 pregnant women and 2 old ladies, or 2 old ladies, or one of, or do you? Choose, and there are lots of variations. You go through screens, and then you can choose. There are doctors, there are overweight people, and slim people to choose from, criminals. I mean, I think they steered away from anything. I mean, I think they should have gone straight to the cut and say, do you want to run over black people or Jewish people, you know, like to, but they shied from the, like, from those questions, and they settled for something a little bit more, you know, palatable. But ultimately the result, you know, they actually went, I didn't think they were going to do it, but they actually went and published the results of the this survey, no, they kept the data as if it had any kind of value as to the decisions of people. But, you know, I think the value is in showing, I mean, this is a classic ethical tool, you know, but in reality it's a tool that shows that the decision itself, you know, is not really the most important thing, but it's the process of deliberation, and no one would try to use this to decide that actually people prefer to run over old people rather than pregnant ladies. So then you have lots of trust marks and processes, you know, like the ethical trust mark. This is the indie project trust mark, but there are many, many others. Again, useful as a, I mean, in the world of data protection, people have been talking about privacy icons, and there is always an ongoing debate. I think there are sessions on this in the next after lunch. You know? So debatable value, you know, but someone has to check that actually the technology can be trusted, and so you need an infrastructure to follow it up. You know? So issues that you get. So just some of the things we are figuring out is what are the ethical assumptions that you make. You know, so many of these things say, yeah, we are doing an ethical tool. So what ethics are you following? I mean, some of them are very clear about maximizing public good, you know, but there are many ethical approaches out there, and what you find is that they don't tend to be exposed, and people work from their assumptions without really questioning their starting point. There are also, as I said, you know, different levels of institutional support, you know, required, demands in the capabilities from, I mean, there are some tools that you can use straight away, others require a lot of background work. There are discussions on participation, regulation, you know, how they fit with regulation, you know, yeah. And for us, one thing that is quite important is how these tools fit with our approach, you know. So the PESIA, you know, it's got, apart from being about ethics and social issues, it's a self-assessment process, but it's participatory and open. And we think that those two things, you know, are some of the missing key elements of the impact assessments in general. And I think that unless you have those, unless you ask people, unless, you know, people who may be affected, and also trying to go even beyond, the people that you think may be affected, there is very little value in an impact assessment. You know, unless you make it public, you know, again, you know, it's not really any good. And then things that other challenges that we are finding is defining the participation, you know, and the governance. This not just for the PESIA, but for the tools. Again, you know, the points on expertise, you know, like how do you find that expertise? And something that we've mentioned before, which is the whole debate around ethics washing, you know, and how do you make sure that whatever you're doing on all these tools don't become a substitute for proper compliance, and it's just like a getaway card, you know, for technologies, you know, to say, well, we did the ethics bit, you know, like now everyone should be happy. And I think, I mean, a few months ago I went to a workshops organized by DeepMind, the AI division of Google in London, where they got a room bigger than this one of people to talk about ethics, and not once did they actually bother to explain what they were actually doing. You know, it was just an abstract debate about ethics, but, you know, it definitely allowed them to say, well, we are talking about ethics, yeah, but you're not talking about what you are doing in relation to ethics, you know, just some abstract debate, and that's, I mean, definitely not good. And the final question that is quite tricky is something that when you start looking at the tool, something that you uncover is actually that the ethical decision-making process, I mean, there is a lot of academic literature on this, which seems to, is based on this, what's called the REST model in general, you know, like awareness, judgment, commitment, and action, and all processes follow, you know, saying awareness, who are your stakeholders, you know, what are the values, you know, what are we going to do, and how you're going to do it. And there are, something that you find is that in practice, you know, the theory sounds very good, but in practice, you know, there is a need for a lot more work to understand how, you know, actually, how people make decisions, both at the individual level and for us also at the organizational level. And those two, you know, don't always fit. So you can have a room full of very nice people. When they all get together to build something, you know, they all may forget, you know, their own principles and just get carried away. So that's it for me. And now I think Annelie is going to...
Thank you, Javier. And I want to only point out that we try to summarize a lot of work, and if you are interested in further details, you can go to the website of the project, Virtue Project, and you find the deliverables that are public, so you can go into details of the different presentation that, due to time constraint, we are not able to further discuss. And
and one more thing. There is all of the empirical fieldwork notes that I referred to are on Medium. So if you are on Medium, you can look for the Virtue account and follow all of our updates there as well.
Thank you, Alison. And so we move from this perspective of the PIGA to the design approach. I think that the design approach is very important because there is a lot of debate about ethical tools or privacy impact assessment tools. Many of the tools are traditional checklists, and I think that a further elaboration about the design approach is useful also in order to have an higher impact on the companies and to induce people to be more engaged in this kind of assessment. For this reason, we focus on this topic, and Annelie gives us the first result of our investigation. Thanks.
Hi. I'm Annelie Berner. I'm coming from the Copenhagen Institute of Interaction Design. And today I'm excited to share with you a few of the areas that we've identified for building tools for IoT developers and designers. So just quickly, often when we think about Internet of Things, data, privacy, ethics, and design, we actually start to think about, okay, what's the process of designing user interfaces, let's say, that will help people to better navigate how that device is using their data, maybe better terms and conditions experiences, or toggles to choose cloud or local storage options. To some extent, this is a skin on top of a device in order to maybe build in control over data that's already being gathered, stored, and processed. Another place where we see design coming in is in somewhat critical design projects. So where a designed object or interface is created in order to, thank you, in order to counteract the device's roots of data sharing, processing, or storing. And those kind of design projects will, to some extent, retroactively control the devices that we've decided are necessary in our lives, but may be overly invasive as they are already. Both of these methods represent design work that's done either on top of or even completely outside of the design process of IoT devices. So in BERT-EU, what we're trying to figure out is how might we actually get inside of that process with IoT developers and designers, and together try to figure out, how this actual device itself could be designed with an ethical perspective. So some of the areas that we've found thus far, as we've been conducting co-creation workshops, doing field work, interviews together with our partners at Org, LSE, and ITU, are the following. So first of all, articulation, continuous articulation of values, actually, and of ethical perspectives throughout the process of building a device. Identifying and trying to address gaps between those values and the choices that are being made on a daily basis. Imagining possible consequences of those choices or decisions through scenario making. And then actually calculating what are the gaps that are happening in order to address the tension there. Using stories to summarize and magnify the aspects of a decision. And then finally returning to that product decision in order to remake it with an ethical perspective. So if I go again more deeply into articulation, this first one, I want to try to basically, if you think about articulation, it can be done once, right? What is your ethical point of view? You just say it once and you're done. But in this project, what we're trying to kind of push for, and what we will be pulling in our tools, is the idea that we can support better visibility into how principles, moral obligations, and values might wax and wane throughout a product's lifespan. So not just once or twice, but every day, let's say. And in order to do this kind of articulation, right, we need to give tools that support both the visualization and externalization of what people say that they care about, and help them keep track of how those values are changing in relation to their work. So the next area that we've identified is about finding gaps. So when I said how those values are doing in relation to their everyday work, I mean that often designers and developers actually need to negotiate the gaps between the values that they hold dear and the values that perhaps their clients or investors or even their own teammates might hold dear. In some cases, the potential for those gaps are not obvious. And in fact, in that case, the need is for tools that would support developers and designers to uncover, express, and reflect upon those gaps, uncovering the unexpected outcomes that could occur at various turning points within a project's design process. So that leads to the next area, which is about imagining unforeseen consequences. And yeah, maybe many of you in this audience can really easily imagine kind of the unimaginable or the unforeseen consequences. And it might be that many of us can kind of do this sort of moral imagination naturally, considering not only the various options to solve a problem or make a decision, but also how those options will react with their values. But what we're trying to do in this area of the tools is to actually prompt developers and designers to envision outside of their head, so that they can actually collaborate around the consequences that they have envisioned and be provoked to consider perspectives or perhaps even destabilizing factors that they might not have considered on their own. So this potentially can allow people to some extent, calculate those gaps that will happen in between the values that they care about and the possible consequences of design decisions while building IoT. And so we don't leave our participants of these workshops and the people who are starting to use these tools in a kind of fictional scenario. Instead, we're trying to lead them to consider and weigh their options and maybe redesign those original options again now that they've seen them through this scenario building lens and with this new value-based calculation of those different options in mind. When I say value-based calculation, I mean quite literally. One of the tools that we're playing with or prototyping is something that the writer Stephen Johnson calls a moral algorithm. It's a self-evaluative but mathematical function that prompts the participants to actually reflect on how well their values and their weighting of those values will align with the options that they're considering around a pivot moment. So one of the almost last areas that we're prototyping with is I call stories to magnify. So here we're actually using a journalistic format to encapsulate the learnings and experience that they might have had thus far in the decision-making process. So the scenario-making work will end in a summary of elements of concern that they themselves have identified throughout this experience. And it is a story format such that when taken to its extreme, it could even be considered as a realistic future press release. Perhaps it will show a PR disaster that's coming their way, or maybe it's the opposite if the calculation is going very positively. And this can become a negotiating tool with which they can communicate persuasively with a stakeholder who might not see the decision in the same light. So here, developers and designers can magnify possible consequences of a decision and communicate in a language that more people around the table might be able to understand. So at the end of this kind of circular process, we want to return and actually remake this product or the decision that is being considered at that moment with this new ethical perspective. So at various points throughout this process, developers and designers could take a moment to actually remake with the learnings they've gained from engaging their ethical and moral muscles and critical questioning. So that was a bit about what we have been learning and focusing on throughout our research and co-design sessions, but it's certainly not the end of the work. And I want to pull out one last kind of moment here, which is about this spectrum we're playing on between simulation and reality when I talk about scenario building or this story that I mentioned. So while we aim to make our tools relevant for specific moments in the process of creating a product, where they can take in a specific product's own components and so on, we also aim to provide tools that will support simulation or rehearsal methods. So a team might first use a series of tools in context of a dilemma for a product that's very relevant but maybe not the same as their product, in order to better be able to jump into situations that are specifically problematic for their own product. So here we see the power of practicing, of rehearsal, and role play. And just as in any profession, you can have possibly unexpected and dangerous consequences. When you're creating an IoT product, you can also have such emergency situations. But what we hope is that through these tools, designers and developers could be prepared to face and navigate those emergencies if they occur, or even better, to have seen them before they occur, so that they can find another way to reach the goal they have. I end on this kind of, again, currently it's linear, but of course it's actually quite a lot more tangled. Which is an overall question. How can we get from the design practice and process as it is right now towards an ethical design process, which will look quite different? And how can we go from just the bare practicing of craft as designers and developers towards the practicing of moral craft? So what we hope is that our kind of design, this design of tools for IoT creators, with this backbone of an ethical framework and the muscle of critical questioning, will be integrated into the design process itself. That developers and designers will practice their craft as routinely as they practice their moral imagination. Thank you.
Thank you all for your presentation, and I want to give the floor for a very quick question before the conclusion. So if there are some questions, please make your question here now and be concise, please. Please use this mic here. It's not so easy, but thank you, Javier.
Is there a button?
If not, you can use the podium. It's the same.
Oh, that's much better. That's always with technology. So, a question maybe to everyone in the panel, but maybe to Javier in the first place. We are witnessing technological convergence. And that has led, I mean, the certain technologies and applications are used globally. And that has led to regulatory convergence. That was what Colin Bennett already predicted in the 1980s, but it's happening now to a certain extent. Do you think that we are witnessing a convergence in ethics too? Are we going to a direction to a universal ethics in the digital world, or still we have very strong differences in the cultural sense, what we need to take into consideration? So
we may collect one question more, and then we give the answer to all the questions.
Hi, I have a question. I think it's largely aimed at Alison, but you made a point about ethics not being a replacement for regulation in law, which I think is very good. I'd appreciate your perspective on using ethics as a replacement in countries that lack regulatory frameworks around data protection. There are a lot of countries in the world that simply don't have laws to protect privacy and to sort of enforce data protection. Because I often hear this argument that in the absence of a good law, we need something, so we'll embrace ethics instead.
Yes, we have one more question from Professor Raab. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Raab, University of Edinburgh. I think my question, if it's pointed at people, it might be Irina and also perhaps Alison. When you're talking about designing products, that's one thing, about ethical design of products, and that's very, very interesting work you're trying to do. But when you talk about the Internet of Things, it's really the deployment and the application of already existing products, and the questions relate to the application of that whole thing in real situations and in real contexts. I'm involved at my university with trying to develop ethical approaches to the Internet of Things deployment and research projects at the university, plus the city jointly are trying to develop. And it's not very easy to do that, because it's mixed up with not mixed up with it, it involves governance questions as well. And you talked, I think it was Irina who talked about self-assessment. Well, self-assessment is a little bit like marking your own homework. And in the case of universities where you have ethics boards that have to approve research projects, then the question there is how you get ethics boards and ethics machinery to understand what the IoT proponents are trying to do. And I wonder whether this comes into your project at all, or is it simply, I wouldn't say simply, but is it focused only on the design of particular products, standalone products perhaps, rather than IoT systems?
Thank you. And the last question from the last rows.
Samson Isaias from University of Oslo. My last question is directed at the last speaker who presented the process for integrating ethics into design. I can see that this long process, you elaborated the process quite well, and it's quite detailed and it's quite interesting. But my question is, how do you see this fit with mostly the dynamic development of now many of the consumer-facing services? There's basically you release the service and you learn. So the design process involves participating users and continuous improvement of the service from the experience. So do you see this long process that you describe being used in this kind of continuous improvement of these consumer-facing services that involves the users as objects of tests? Thanks.
Thank you. And I suggest to the speaker to address one specific question instead of discuss all the questions. This question that is more related to your topic in order to have a more exhaustive reply. Thank you.
I'm gonna try to start with the first, the question about ethics convergence and ethics as a replacement for law in places that law does not apply, since these are related. This is something that people have tried to look at across the philosophy of technology space. If you are going to rely on ethics, ethics is a culturally determined set of principles and practices, and there are some inherent limitations of our project. One of them is that we are relying on kind of the Western philosophical tradition, which comes out of the Enlightenment, which is primarily focused on the idea of individual agency. These are major constraints for the way that we're able to think about ethics. We are not really able to think about relational ethics in this project, although I do in other work. And we are not really able to think about, for example, a kind of like deep reciprocity between people and their contexts, as you might find in some indigenous philosophy. However, what we have been able to do is to combine the virtue ethics tradition with the care ethics and capability frameworks to provide a counterpoint to the ways that ethics have been discussed as consequential, and to move the kind of focus on how people are doing their work and how we can think about the relationships that people have between each other as they produce technologies. So this does allow us to get a little bit outside of this framework. The problem of convergence, the problem of, I don't think I would think about convergence. I might think about like ethics as colonialism. If we want to be more precise, if we're talking about applying a particular ethical framework as if it were the only one that we could have in every context in the world, then we are basically talking about a kind of, the same problem we've had with many forms of colonialism over time. It is possible to think about ethics decolonially. The issue here is to continue to focus on what are the shared values and the shared principles that we have across the globe. And I would point back to universal human rights frameworks as one of the ones that has been well worked out, although this is also contentious. So it's very hard to answer that question, except to say it is something that is very hard to answer and something we are thinking about. Again, human rights can be a framework that you can employ in places without law. I'll stop there. Do you want to say?
So just to add on the convergence, there is actually, in virtue ethics particularly, there is now a big discussion around convergence of traditional Chinese ethical models on Buddhism, and they're trying to go back basically to the old, 2,500 years ago, when some of the ideas were spreading from Greece all the way to China in the really ancient world. So there is now, as the old world is revealed, like China retakes and the Far East and India retake like their old world position, and Western Europe's influence goes down. There is a little bit of a move to try to recreate a kind of global ethics around going back to Aristotle and Buddhism and things like that. But I mean, it's still a long way, I would agree.
So I'll tend to talk a little bit about the deployment application and this thinking about the systems and governance of IoT rather than looking at self-assessment. Yes, absolutely. Self-assessment is a very individualized mode of thinking, fits within the kind of virtue ethics ethos, but clearly is insufficient. One of the things that we ran into immediately as we started working on the project is that virtue ethics was not enough, and you couldn't really work within that space, which is why our framework had to include other approaches and to think more broadly, in part because when the first thing we realized is that it's not just development of products. It is the fact that these products are developed within systems that are incredibly constraining, that the people that develop these products don't have a huge amount of wiggle room, and that really you might want to be ethical, but the space to perform that is narrow and limited. In terms of looking at larger entities such as cities and city deployments and universities, there too, one of the problems is that when they engage with smaller actors, again, you have a kind of a problem of thinking about infrastructures that define what's possible and what's not possible. You've run into the problem that if you're developing an IoT product and deploying sensors, you're actually having to rely on a number of other modular pieces of software and other kinds of APIs and other kinds of data flows that immediately involve a whole host of other actors that you have to engage. And then the question is, who is ethical of these actors, and how do you engage with that ethics, and what's ethical in the end? So yes, the problem is tangled, and it's really difficult, and I can't imagine explaining it to an internal review board of a university, frankly. So, respect, because that would be difficult. At the same time, what we're trying to do is try to figure out, how do you support developers given the fact that they need to deal with this? Given the fact that there's an expectation that developers should know what to do, should be ethical, should perform ethics in some way, without really engaging with how might that actually be done in practice? because in practice, that's difficult. So what we're looking at, in fact, to some extent, is literally looking at infrastructures for ethical discourse and ethical discussions, and how do you implement those within these small spaces?
Yeah. I think we do need to have more of a consensus on ethics quite urgently across the globe, because technology has been spreading globally beyond borders. I'm not sure about a convergence, but an obvious example is the inability of the UN to even agree to start discussions on what to do about killer drones. That's an ethical question. Should you allow an autonomous machine to take the life of a human being? So we're a long way away, and we need to speed up. On the question of what if the sort of data protection deserts around the world, and if there's a sort of arc from the Horn of Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa across to China, where there is a lack of independent oversight of people's freedom and data protection rights. That's being filled by companies opportunistically, and all that's there at the moment is an ethical framework or a lack thereof. And the interesting thing about China is that, first of all, they're colonizing Africa by giving them cheap devices and apps in order to get data. In the absence of a data protection framework. On the other hand, in China itself, you could say that ethics is subverting the law, the rule of law, because with the social credit system, people are being denied due process of law because they're being scored according to an algorithmic formula.
I'm going to comment directly on the next, the question that you had for us about, okay, so that was quite a lot of different techniques and tools that we're kind of asking people to do, right? And how does that become part of their actual development process when there's many other things to worry about, as far as I understood. So there it is genuinely about, thinking, instead of just having, let's say, a software update, right, for the software part of an IoT product, perhaps you're actually also implementing a moral update or an ethical update, so that just as much as you redesign and redeploy the aspects of your actual product in order to make your product function more efficiently, it should also be at the same time that you're considering the ethical and moral dimensions of the product that you're making and those updates. So that's one aspect. The other is that, yeah, it's a difficult thing. And we're actually in this next period very much studying all the different design and development processes and trying to understand how perhaps the first or third or fifth kind of area that I showed could be relevant at different points within those design and development processes. So it's not necessary that you would go through every single thing. Perhaps, tool or area 4 is super relevant at the ideation phase for your company, whereas area 4 might be really relevant at the final evaluation phase for a different company. We have to look into this, but you can follow all the updates on the website.
But also, I think So just to say as well that the idea of instrumentalizing software to constantly get data in itself is an ethical issue. So it's like you can't start from the assumption that that is how software is made nowadays, and also something else that here we are looking at physical products, so that kind of is a bit cheating in a way. So we are made our life a little bit easier by looking at products and also by looking at particular sectors of the industry. So with a product you do have a more traditional, there is an end process, and even if you are then doing continuous improvement on the software side and pushing updates, which in IoT tends to be the opposite, you tend to get stuck with the firmware and there's no way to introduce any security features. So the kind of decisions like you need to be able to update the software, you should then collect the data. So it's almost like at a meta level, many of the things that you are talking about are real issues, but the decisions start even earlier, I think.
You see, our panelists are very enthusiastic of their work, and we work a lot on that. And I want to thank all you for your presentation, and I want to give to Eleni the floor for the final remarks about these very, very different topics. Thank you, Eleni.
Well, thank you. Given the time, actually, given the lack of time, I will be very brief. I was very happy to actually get a better understanding of what is this PESIA, your privacy, ethics, and social impact assessment. The questions helped in clarifying and also raising some of the concerns that we have. So I think we will be keeping an eye on how you do this, because we all need some tools, and we definitely need to go beyond self-assessment at a later stage. I find it exciting that you work with IoT developers, and you're splitting them between doers and postponers. I think will be very useful for the research that you're doing and for further research. And I would like to just close this with a quote mentioned by Christian, that the law floats on a sea of ethics, and I think this has become a very clear realization for all of us. And I would like to thank you all for being here, and thank you for your great interest in this topic.